Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on the Supporting Anaerobic Digestion in Communities funding opportunity offered by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. This webinar is sponsored by the EPA's Sustainable Materials Management Web Academy. My name is Katie Harrison and I'm part of the webinar support team at ERG, which is a contractor supporting this effort. I will be managing the technical aspects of today's webinar. While we wait for others to log on, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. By now, you should have the Zoom application running and should see the welcome presentation on your screen. At the bottom of your screen is your control panel. Audio is available through your computer's speakers and by telephone. To change your audio settings, click on the audio options, which is located on the left side of your control panel. Currently, all attendees have been muted to preserve audio quality. If you are having technical difficulties using Zoom, you can go to support.zoom.us and click on Users and Participants in the center of the page to access the FAQs. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties with any Zoom feature while running or attending the webinar, you can use the chat option at the bottom of the screen and direct your question in the drop-down box to me, Katie Harrison. I am the designated host of this webinar, and you'll see my name followed by the title Zoom Support in parentheses. I'm here to help you at any point. Just send me a message to the chat. You're also welcome to send me an email to catherine.harrison@erg.com if the chat box isn't working for you. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to download a PDF copy of the PowerPoint slides from this presentation is in the chat box. I'm actually going to put that in for you right now. Chat. Here we go. Live captions are also available for this webinar, and you can access them by clicking on the CC closed caption icon on your control bar. We encourage you to ask questions throughout this presentation. So to submit a question or comment for the presenters, please type your question into the Q&A box and click Send to submit it. We will have a dedicated time for questions and answers after the presentations have concluded. And if we run out of time and are not able to answer all of your questions during the webinar, we will be logging these questions and answering them on the SMM Web Academy website. After today's webinar, there will be a short evaluation. Please take a moment to fill it out. Your feedback is vital to helping us provide the highest quality speakers and information to meet your needs. So thank you all again for joining the August Sustainable Materials Management Web Academy webinar. We're happy to have you participating. This 60-minute webinar is hosted by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to provide training and a networking opportunity to state and local governments, non-governmental organizations, and other stakeholders interested in sustainable materials management. Today's EPA-hosted webinar will present information for those seeking to apply for the Supporting Anaerobic Digestion, or AD, in communities requests for applications being offered by EPA this year, which total up to $2 million. EPA is seeking applications that will accelerate the development of new AD capacity and infrastructure in the United States, or enhance and increase existing AD capacity and infrastructure. The webinar will review the funding opportunity, key sections of the application, who is eligible to apply, and the application process. Our speakers today are Chris Carasello, a member of the Sustainable Materials Management, or SMM program, who works on the built environment and the sustainable management of food areas. We also have James Drummond, a member of the Office of Grants and Debarment. As a friendly reminder, we will answer questions after the formal presentations conclude. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box throughout the webinar. And moving into today's webinar, please note this disclaimer. We'll leave this up for another 10 seconds or so. And now to our speakers. As we mentioned, today's format will be 60 minutes with our speaker presenting, and then we will handle your questions at the end. So without further ado, please welcome Chris Carasello.
Thank you so much, Katie. We have a full agenda today. We're going to start with the introduction, where we'll cover the goals of the webinar, get into sustainable materials management, and cover anaerobic digestion. Then we'll move into the overview of the funding opportunity. Next, we'll discuss the requirements of the grant from the authority, eligibility, regulatory requirements, etc. It's going to be very informative. And after a discussion of the requirements, we'll talk about the evaluation portion of the grant competition. We'll conclude by providing useful resources and have some time at the end for questions and answers. Now, let's get started. The goals of today's webinar are to 1, provide an overview of the Sustainable Materials Management request for applications for potential applicants and interested stakeholders, and 2, to clarify the information and answer questions about the application and review process to help potential applicants submit high-quality applications for funding consideration. As you may know, the RFA was posted on July 9th, so it's been out for a few weeks now, and hopefully many of you have had a chance to either read it or to take some time to look at it. My core objective here is to have you come away from this webinar feeling like you have a good starting point to structure your grant projects and to begin drafting your applications if you haven't done so already. We're not going to be able to answer questions that are outside the scope of the RFA on today's webinar. Sustainable materials management refers to how we manage material resources as they flow through the economy. Everything from extraction or harvest of materials and food, for example, the mining, the forestry, and the agriculture, to the design and production, the packaging and distribution, the use and maintenance, to the reuse of materials and recovery and recycling, and if necessary, even the disposal. From a life cycle perspective, end-of-life strategies address only one life cycle stage of a material or product. By considering system-wide impacts, SMM casts a far broader net than traditional waste and chemicals management approaches, and represents a change in how we think about environmental impacts. There's important work to be done at the end of life, but if we are to deal with the complex human health and environmental issues, address material resource issues, and yes, to reduce or eliminate waste in the first place, then it is essential we transition to SMM. SMM encourages life cycle-based decision-making and collaborative and integrative approaches to problem solving. This represents a radical change in how we think about environmental impacts and economics, and these principles need to be applied at all levels, from the community all the way to the global economy. Now, in fiscal years 19 and 20, Congress provided EPA with funds to help public entities demonstrate community anaerobic digestion applications to municipal solid waste streams and farm needs, such as capturing excess phosphorus. Last year, we held our first national competition for anaerobic digestion funding. Now again, in FY21, Congress has provided EPA with funding to support AD. Anaerobic digestion is the natural process in which microorganisms break down organic materials. In this instance, organic means coming from or made of plants and animals. Anaerobic digestion happens in closed spaces where there's no oxygen. This is different than composting, which is aerobic with oxygen. During the process, biogas and a solid and liquid digestate are generated. Communities and businesses across the country use biogas to power engines, produce mechanical power, heat, or electricity, to fuel boilers and furnaces, heating digesters and other spaces, to run alternative fuel vehicles, and to supply homes and businesses throughout the natural gas pipeline. Digestate can be made into products like bedding for livestock, flower pots, soil amendments, fertilizers, etc. Now to make our way to the overview of the funding opportunity. EPA is soliciting applications for a wide variety of projects that are designed to increase the use of AD for the management of organic materials in the United States. All of the applications must achieve one or more of the following objectives: to develop new or expand existing AD capacity for processing food waste, to demonstrate solutions and/or approaches for increasing food waste AD utilization that can be replicated by other communities, governments, or other entities, and that support state, tribal, and/or local government programs that seek to use AD to increase their food waste diversion rates. In addition, EPA is seeking AD projects that address environmental justice concerns and focus predominantly on addressing the disproportionate and adverse human health, environmental, climate-related, and other cumulative impacts, as well as the accompanying economic challenges of such impacts, resulting from industrial, governmental, commercial, and/or other actions that have affected and/or currently affect people or communities of color, low income, tribal, and indigenous populations, and if applicable, other vulnerable populations, such as the elderly, children, and those with pre-existing medical conditions. EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Fair treatment means that no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, and commercial operations or policies. Meaningful involvement means that people have an opportunity to participate in decisions about activities that may affect their environment and/or health. The public's contribution can influence the regulatory agency's decision. Community concerns will be considered in the decision-making process, and that decision makers will seek out and facilitate the involvement of those potentially affected. For more information on environmental justice, see the website on the slide below. So, the types of projects that may include in this funding opportunity include technology and process evaluations, technical assistance, outreach and/or training to model or accelerate solutions, outreach workshops, demonstration projects for technology to improve collection or quality of feedstocks, feasibility studies, expanding processing capacity through technology demonstration projects or training or technical assistance, or demonstration, training, or technical assistance projects for developing or improving feedstock collection networks. This list is not inclusive though. Please see page 4 of the RFA for additional projects that may be considered. And even on that page, those aren't inclusive. So there are more opportunities for the work. Now let's spend some time discussing the more technical requirements for this funding opportunity. First, it's important to be aware of the funding authority for the grant. Like I mentioned before, in FY21, Congress provided EPA with funds to help public entities demonstrate community AD applications to municipal solid waste streams and farm needs, such as capturing excess phosphorus. Based on our statutory authority, funding will be given to projects that focus on learning, such as pilots or demonstrations. The projects are awarded under the general authority of the Solid Waste Disposal Act, Section 8001, and must include in the project conducting or promoting the coordination of research, investigations, experiments, training, demonstrations, surveys, public education programs, or studies related to solid waste. For construction or equipment costs, For improvements to 80 facilities to be allowable, the project must qualify as a demonstration. The initial exhibition of a new technology process or practice, or a significantly new combination or use of technologies, processes, or practices subsequent to the development stage for the purpose of proving technological feasibility and cost effectiveness. It must involve new or experimental technologies, methods, or approaches where the results of the project will be disseminated so that others may benefit from this knowledge gained in the demonstration project. A project that is accomplished through the performance of routine, traditional, or established practices, or a project that is simply intended to carry out a task rather than transfer information or advance the state of knowledge, however worthwhile that project may be, is not a demonstration. Grant proposals should emphasize this learning concept as opposed to just fixing an environmental problem via a well-established method. For example, a proposed project to expand the capacity of an AED facility by installing equipment that is in wide use or simply increasing the size of a facility would not qualify as a demonstration project. EPA strongly recommends that applicants for demonstration project funding, like this grant, explain how the project meets the statutory definition of demonstration and describe how the results of the project will be evaluated and disseminated to researchers, AD facility operators, regulators, and other parties interested in advancing AD technology. Applicants may propose to fund the cost for AD facility participation in demonstration projects through non-competitive subawards or subsidies for equipment purchases to the extent allowable in EPA's subaward policy and guidance on participant support costs. These subawards or participant support costs may fund the participation of for-profit facilities in the demonstration projects. Neither subaward nor participant support costs may be used for the purchase of commercial services from consulting firms, engineering firms, etc. We're going to get more into subawards and procurement contracts later on in the presentation. So what organizations are eligible for the grant? Those that are eligible include any of the 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and Northern Mariana Islands, local, tribal, interstate, and intrastate government agencies and instrumentalities. Also, nonprofit organizations, nonprofit educational institutions, and nonprofit hospitals are all eligible to apply. What organizations are not eligible? Nonprofit organizations that lobby, individuals, and for-profit organizations are all not eligible. Now let's talk about the grant funding. The total estimated funding shall not exceed $2 million. EPA anticipates awarding 1 to 2 cooperative agreement grants per EPA region in amounts ranging from $50,000 to $200,000 per award. Applicants may submit separate applications for one or more of the projects described in Section 1B, Scope of Work. Applications for federal funding for each award may not exceed $200,000. In your application, please include the location where the project will be taking place. If the project will occur in more than one location, indicate the city and state associated with the primary location. EPA reserves the right to reject all applications and to make no awards. and the estimated start date for projects is March 1st, 2022. All project activities must be completed within the negotiated project performance period of 2 years, and the funds may not be used for projects that are already complete and paid for. Although EPA policy is to allow for pre-award costs in certain circumstances, all pre-award costs are subject to the allowability standards of 2 CFR 200.458. A pre-design or other project that is already completed and paid for prior to selection will not meet the regulatory standard, since those costs were not incurred pursuant to the negotiation and anticipation of the award. In addition to that, EPA expects to award approximately $800,000 of the estimated total specifically for awards to the following organizations: U.S. territories, tribal governments, tribal colleges and universities, or eligible organizations located in persistent poverty counties. Persistent poverty counties are counties that have had poverty rates of 20% or greater for at least 30 years. To be considered for this set-aside, the organization must be located in a persistent poverty county at the time of application submission. Please see the site below for a listing of persistent poverty counties based on data from the census. EPA may adjust the funding for the set-aside based on the quality of applications received, agency priorities, and other relevant considerations. Now I'm going to turn it over to James Drummond to talk about some EPA regulatory grant requirements.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm James Drummond. I'm with the Office of Grants and Debarment. Prior to that, I was in EPA's General Counsel's office as a grants attorney. I'm going to focus today a lot on the difference between subawards and procurement contracts and the different types of requirements. We have a detailed subaward policy, which is available on our website, and I believe we're going to have links to that, Chris, and that gives you a lot of information on distinguishing between the two, because it's very important to characterize your transactions accurately. When you're submitting your application, for example, if you identify a quote partner, and I'll get more into the term partner again, whether or not that partner can receive funds without competition, as in the case of a subaward or participant support costs, or whether competition is required in the case of all commercial transactions with consulting engineering firms or purchases of equipment. These are the regulatory sites. I'm not going to read the regulations to you unless we don't receive any questions, and then that's not a very pretty site. So please ask questions. That's what we're here for. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the subaward policy is a financial assistance transaction. Profit is not allowable between recipient and eligible subrecipient, or as it flows down to other subrecipients. It's for accomplishing a public purpose authorized by the federal program statute, in this case, Section 8001 of the Solid Waste Disposal Act. It doesn't include payments to procurement contractors or payments to an individual that's a beneficiary or participant in the federal program. We have a separate guidance on participant support costs. Next slide, please. In contrast to subawards, procurement contractors, including individual consultants, provide goods and services on commercial terms, provide similar goods and services to many different purchasers, operate in a competitive environment, and a reasonable profit is allowable. Transactions with for-profit companies and individual consultants are, with very, very few exceptions, procurement contracts. I'm going to get into one of those exceptions perhaps in one of the other slides that Chris mentioned, and that would be a subaward to a facility operator to help them participate in a demonstration project. Next slide, please. With the exception of states, all recipients must comply with procurement requirements in the grant regulations. states follow the same procedures as they do for their non-federal funds, with a couple of exceptions, the most important of which is the requirements for small and disadvantaged business participation, which has an EPA-specific regulation at 40 CFR Part 33. We strongly encourage applicants and recipients to consider small and disadvantaged businesses whenever they're constructing their bidders lists and soliciting contract proposals. We've got a detailed best practices guide for procuring services that provides much more detailed information on our interpretation of the grant procurement requirements. Next slide, please, Chris. There are 2 thresholds for competition for procurements for AD grants. There are 3 thresholds and the regulations, but the size of these grants is such that you're not going to be above $250,000. So we're just going to focus on those 2 thresholds. Purchases at the micro purchase level, it recently increased to $10,000, may be made without competition, provided the recipient distributes the purchase equitably among qualified suppliers to the extent practical and the prices are reasonable. Purchases of supplies is an example of a micro purchase, including computing devices. Again, the equitable distribution qualification means that the same series of micro purchases with the same instructor or speaker fees, if you're doing conferences or consultants, without using other sources as well, will raise compliance issues. I refer to this when I was in my law practice as audit bait. It's a bunch of $10,000 non-competitive purchase to the same firm repeatedly over time is not compliant with the regulations. Some universities or nonprofit research institutions may have higher micro purchase threshold if approved by the cognizant federal agency for indirect costs. And we, of course, defer to those higher approved micro purchase levels. Next, please. May use small purchase procedures for contracts up to the simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000. That would be all of your purchases here, since the maximum amount of the grant is $200,000. What EPA does, again, in our best practices, expects recipients to get prices or quotes from at least 3 sources. For professional services, you can use email solicitations, document that for your files, just ask the source to provide you with the qualifications, their approach to the scope, to your needs, and to provide you with their prices. Of course, under the regulations, if a potential contractor prepares that solicitation or prepares your specifications, that contractor cannot, I repeat, cannot compete for that contract. That's also in the regulations in the competition section at 200 point, I believe 319. So that is a prohibited practice. For equipment, internet searches of price catalogs by screenshots and documentation is acceptable. You must justify selection of contractors quoting higher prices or rates based on technical factors. And again, as I mentioned, good faith efforts must be made to solicit disadvantaged businesses. And another rule of thumb out there for auditors, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So document your procurement files when you're conducting these types of solicitations. Next slide, please. Sole source. Procurement by non-competitive proposals is through solicitation of only one source and may be only used when one or more of the following apply. The items available for one source, public exigency, EPA approves the request in response to writing, or after solicitation of a number of sources, competition is not adequate. EPA's position is that sole source procurements are justified by copyrights, patents, equipment maintenance agreements with manufacturers or similar arrangements. And I've got this in red for a reason. XYZ contractor is familiar with our program, and we have partnered with the firm or individual for years. That doesn't cut it. That simply doesn't cut it. And if you're out there for engineering services, for consulting services, That's the commercial marketplace is rich. And the quote, best contractor is not the only contractor. So keep that in mind. Next, please. Again, prior to naming a partner in your application who receive EPA funding, carefully review the guidance. We've got detailed guidance in our solicitations on contracts and subawards, as well as additional guidance in the RFA. So read that. Just naming somebody as a partner in your application does not relieve you of any of the requirements in the regulations for competition or for price reasonableness. Next slide, please. Does EPA consider all partnership agreements that establish funding relationships to be subawards that aren't subject to competition? No. Transactions are either subawards, procurement contracts, and in some cases, intergovernmental agreements for common procurement, interagency service agreements for services, participant support costs. Characterizing the transactions consistently with the terms used in the Uniform Grant Guidance, that's UGG, is important for determining what rules will govern the agreement. Some recipients refer to their contractors and particular consultants as partners. So the label the recipient places on the transaction is not determinative. Next, please. I think it's over to you, Chris.
Thank you so much, James. Really appreciate that. And feel free to put in questions in the question and answer box for either myself or for James, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. So now we're going to make our way over to evaluating applications. So the first step in evaluating applications is the threshold evaluation. Applications must meet the 7 threshold criteria when they submit their application. Applications that fail to meet any one of the threshold criteria will not be considered further. Therefore, it's essential to pass this check. The first threshold criteria is that the applications must address the mandatory program objectives and elements described in section 1B, scope of work of the announcement. Number 2 is that the applications must be from an eligible entity. Number 3 is that the federal funds requested must not exceed $200,000. Number 4 is that the application must be for eligible activities under the Solid Waste Disposal Act. If the application is submitted that includes any ineligible activities, that portion of the application will be ineligible for funding, and it may render the entire application ineligible for funding. Number 5 is that the applications must substantially comply with the application submission instructions and requirements set forth in section 4B. That's how you submit the application. Number 6 is that the applications must be submitted through grants.gov before the application deadline. And number 7 is that any applications submitted after the submission deadline will be considered late and deemed ineligible without further consideration unless the applicant can demonstrate it was due to EPA mishandling or because of technical problems associated with grants.gov or sam.gov system issues. So what do you need to submit to EPA to apply for this grant? Well, here is a list of the materials you will need to submit for the application. These forms can be found in the solicitation on grants.gov. They can also be found at the hyperlinks on the slide here if you download the slides. Please note, if you fill out the forms outside of grants.gov, you will need to fill them out in grants.gov again for the submission. So it's highly recommended to just fill them out in grants.gov unless you're waiting on a SAM registration or a DUNS number or some sort of login. So first, let's discuss the mandatory documents, okay? The first document is the standard form 424 Application for Federal Assistance. In this form, you will input high-level information about your organization and the project. Next is the standard form 424A, which is budget information for non-construction programs. In this form, you'll include budget. It's a budget standard form that is required, and it divides out requested funds into categories such as personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, etc. Next is going to be the project attachment form, and this is the narrative proposal as well as the budget table and description. So this is really the bread and butter of the application materials. This is where you will describe your project and write about how you're addressing the evaluation criteria. This year, we're asking for the narrative proposal and budget table and description to be combined into one PDF, and that's called the project attachment form. The next document is the EPA Key Context Form 5700-54, and this lists your contacts, like the authorized representative, payee, administrative contact, and project manager. And the last mandatory form is the EPA Form 4700-4, Pre-Award Compliance Review Report. This form collects information that enables EPA to determine whether applicants are developing projects, programs, and activities on a non-discriminatory basis. In addition to the mandatory documents, you can submit other optional attachments. These other attachments include works cited, references, milestones, letters of support, or your CV or resume. And we ask that all of these documents are combined into one PDF as well. Applications must contain a project attachment form, which is made up of the narrative proposal and budget table and description. This is going to be one PDF that includes the 11-page narrative proposal, and included in the 11 pages, the first page. One moment, please. Okay, this is going to be one PDF that includes the 11-page narrative proposal, and included in those 11 pages, the first page should be the summary information page. We'll go over that in a second. Then the 10 pages should be addressing the evaluation criteria. Sorry, I had to unmute for a second there. The 4-page budget table and description is the next thing that's included in the 1-page PDF, and that will address the budget criterion that we'll be discussing in a bit. You can find an example of these items in Appendix A and B of the RFA. Factual information about your proposed project must be provided. Do not include discussions of broad principles that are not specific to the proposed work or project considered by your application. Trust me, use the page limits provided for information about your project. Vague descriptions, redundancy, and failure to address each of the evaluation criteria will result in a lower score. Please use the appendices as examples, especially the part in them where they label where you're addressing certain criteria. Your application should have those headers to help reviewers find your information. So Appendix A, template for narrative proposal, has that information. I'm going to go over the information to include on your one-page summary information page. The first thing is the project title. This is the title of your project. Second is your applicant name. So identify the name of the organization submitting your application. 3 is the eligible entity type. Identify your organization's organization type from Section 3A, eligible entities. In addition, if you qualify for the set-aside, indicate that here. Four is the project type. Identify the project types that are covered for your project. There is not a specific list for this, but you can use the list in Section 1B, Scope of Work, starting on page 5 of the RFA. That list, however, is not inclusive of all the project types. Section 5 is the DUNS number. Please put that here too. Section 6 is the project summary. Briefly describe the project in 2 to 4 sentences. Section 7 is contact information. Include the name, title, address, email address, and phone number. You can list both the primary and an administrative contact. These will be the points of contact for when we send out the successful or unsuccessful application emails. Section 8 is the project location. Include the location where the project will be taking place. If the project will occur in more than one location, indicate the city and state associated with the primary location. Number 9 is the total project cost. Specify the total cost of the project. Identify funding from other sources, including leveraging or in-kind resources. 10 is the EPA funding requested. Specify the amount you're requesting from the EPA. 11 is the project period. Estimated beginning and ending dates of the project. 12 is the program objective elements. State one or more of the 3 total mandatory program objective elements addressed from Section 1B, Scope of Work. And number 13 is the Solid Waste Disposal Act relevancy. Specify how this project falls under the authority of the Solid Waste Disposal Act, Section 8001. Getting into the evaluation criteria. Eligible entities whose applications meet the eligibility information in Section 3 of the announcement will be reviewed according to the evaluation criteria set forth in the following slides. So if you pass the threshold, you get to be evaluated. Each application will be rated under a points system with a total of 100 points possible. Applicants must directly and explicitly address these criteria in the template for narrative proposal in Appendix A. Now let's take a look at the evaluation criteria. These are all listed in detail in Section 5 of the RFA. Criteria 1 is the project summary and approach, and this is worth 25 points. You can read these here on the slide. I'm just going to quickly go through these. It's pretty much all in the RFA, just so that we have some time at the end for questions. Criterion 2 is environmental justice. Criterion 3 is programmatic capability and past performance criterion. Criterion 4 discusses effective partnerships. Criterion 5 is the budget and expenditure of awarded grant funds. Important to note is that this criterion should be answered in the 4-page budget table and description. See Appendix B in the RFA for an example of how one is written. Criterion 6 is congressional direction. Criteria 7 is transferability. Criterion 8 is project sustainability. Criterion 9 is novel approaches. And that is the final criterion. So here are some useful resources to take advantage of for the funding opportunity. Here are some tips for preparing your applications. Start early. The fact that you're attending this webinar, asking questions, and engaged is a good sign. Keep that work up until your application is submitted. Line up partners. We've stressed the importance of partnerships, so please do that appropriately, of course. The power of appropriate partnerships can help a project be successful. Double check your calculations. When working on your budget, your timeline, or anything that needs calculations, maybe those outcomes and outputs as part of Criterion 1, to ensure accuracy. Also provide detailed descriptions of your proposed work. We have dedicated reviewers for the applications, but I would err on the side of being overly descriptive in certain details. Have some people read it over and make sure the language is clear and detailed. And please do stay within the 11-page limit, so be clear and efficient with your words. Also clearly demonstrate the threshold and evaluation criteria. These are very important to ensure your application is reviewed and that you get the points so that it can be awarded. And lastly, use the template provided. This not only makes it easier for you to write the application, but also for reviewers to find the information and give you points. Please use the template. Here are some online resources that might be useful to view when developing your application. Links specific to anaerobic digestion are on the left, and links specific to grants are on the right. Thank you so much for your attention as we went over the slides today on the RFA. Now we'll open it up to questions we've received via Zoom Gov. Give us a minute or two to go through those that have come in, and while we do that, please feel free to download the slides. Here is my contact information on the left if you have any additional questions as well. And here's instructions for how to access the Q&A box and a chat for technical difficulties.
Hey, Chris, it's James Drummond. Can you hear me?
I can, yes. I was just unmuting.
Yeah, I have got some questions in here, and because you were in the part of your presentation that really didn't involve me, I've answered a couple of the questions that have come in. So if people can look at the chats, I got some good questions, and I tried to give them the best answers I could. If the questioners need further clarification, just please put it in the chat box.
Okay, sounds good. Are there any that you see there that might be good to answer for everyone, or are they very specific to a particular person?
This is Christina Torres. I believe that the questions James answered are actually in your Q&A box, so look there as well.
Mute. Chris, yes, I'm going to address, and I'm sorry to the person I was talking away on mute, so I'm the first one that gets caught with you're on mute. Asked if we can repeat what was said about pre-award expenses. And I'll just reiterate what Chris said. The regulations require that pre-award costs be pursuant to the negotiation or anticipation of an award. So if you incur, and pre-award costs typically are going to be 90 days prior to award, that's the normal rule that we allow them. So for example, if you get advised by EPA that you've been selected for funding and you go ahead and get started on your project, because you've been notified that you've been selected, you would meet the regulatory requirement for it to be in anticipation and pursuant to the negotiation of the award, because you know you're going to get the award. All pre-award costs are incurred at your expense, at your own risk. There's selection, notification of selection is not the same as an award. There's a whole process that happens after selection before award. But if you have been notified of selection, let's say you've been notified that you've been selected for a demonstration project and you want to go ahead and do some of the pre-construction engineering costs, or even better, to begin your procurement process and incur the cost of going through your competition process and eventually charge those staff expenses to the grant, you would meet that requirement, the regulation, that would be in anticipation of the award. I would again try to keep it within your timing, within 90 days of when the award is going to be expected, because that doesn't require us to give you prior approval, just easier. The costs must be eligible and allowable. So for example, if you are planning on charging contractor costs and the contract would not comply with the procurement regulations, that wouldn't be an eligible and allowable cost. Hopefully that answers that part of it. What Chris said and emphasized is if the project is already complete, you've already, if you're doing feasibility studies and you've got a feasibility study that may be a wonderful feasibility study that would otherwise meet the requirements of the grant, but it's already completed, then that wouldn't be in anticipation of the award because you have done that feasibility study already. So that would not qualify. Same for if you're asking for money for an otherwise eligible activity. Let's say, for example, something did qualify as a demonstration project, some of those construction costs. If that's prior to being notified that you have been selected, it would not meet the pre-award cost requirements because that's not in anticipation of the award. If that didn't answer your question, please ask for further clarification in the chat. Let me go on, Chris, and see the ones that are from me.
Yeah. Yeah, I can answer a couple that I see right now.
You go right ahead. Ahead. I'll go mute now, and I'll look for some that are more in my end.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had one question about the submission date and the announcement of awards. So the submission date is October 7th at 11:59 p.m. And the announcement of the awards, we're going to try to announce the awards by the end of the calendar year in December, but that's just our estimate. It might take a little bit longer. We will make sure to let everyone who's notified on the front page of the application is who we're going to send out our emails for either successful or unsuccessful applications. And the specific links to the 424 and 424A forms, those will be in grants.gov when you go in to apply via that system. You can also, if you download the slides here, you can get those via the links on the slides. And I also see a question about the template that I was mentioning, the template provided. And so that's going to be in Appendix A in the actual RFA. You can find the RFA on grants.gov. You can also find them on our EPA website, the website that links to the grant. It's there as well. And that template is going to be in Appendix A. So it's actually in the RFA on page 32, I believe, is where it starts. There's the Appendix A, which is for the application, and then Appendix B is for the budget table and description. And then I have another question about clarify on if the digester must utilize biosolids as a feedstock. The digester does not have to utilize biosolids as a feedstock. However, the anaerobic digestion process should include food waste as part of the feedstock. We probably have time for maybe one more question. I don't know, Jim, if you want to answer one, or I can see if there's another here.
So just the person that asked about it, the question, can we apply if construction's already started, can wait? I'll respond to that one in writing. Working on the RFP, can you say more about appropriate partners? I can answer that one. 424, James, I'm a university, we'd like to need any further company to build it. I think, Jennifer, I think I answered your question. If you're a university, you applied for the grant, your physical AD system is going to have to qualify as a demonstration project, or else the construction cost is not eligible. You can hire an engineering firm to help design it and a construction company to build it, as long as you follow competitive procurement procedures that comply with the grant regulations. And one thing I did mention, I failed to mention to everyone about A&E firms. Under the regulations, A&E firms, you need not make price. You're a selection factor. You can compete A&E firms on the basis of qualifications. The price doesn't necessarily be reasonable, but you can do a qualifications-based competition. But it's got to be only for design and engineering work. It can't be for the actual construction work. Because sometimes A&E firms are also construction firms, but you can do the design for that one. Jennifer, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to wrap things up right now. So I'm gonna pass it over to Katie in a second. Thank you so much, James. I really appreciate you having here, and Lucille to answer questions. For the questions that we didn't get to, we're gonna work on answering those and putting them up on the EPA website so that everyone will have access to those questions because they're really good questions. So that concludes the question and answer part of the webinar. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Katie.
Thank you, Chris. We wish to thank today's speakers for their insights on how to apply for EPA's Supporting Anaerobic Digestion in Communities funding opportunity. And finally, most of all, we want to thank you for joining this SMM Web Academy and hope you continue to join us. It is you that this program is designed for, so please make sure you complete our evaluation. We value your feedback because it helps us meet your needs. We will post today's webinar recording and slides in about 2 weeks. And please join us for the next SMM Web Academy webinar coming soon. The registration link for this webinar will also be posted on the SMM Web Academy website soon. So this concludes today's EPA SMM Web Academy session. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, this is Jim. I'm going to be answering questions in the chat for people over the next half hour or so.